day. Before I proceed with this video, just a quick reminder to anybody who's watching us on Rumble, that is to say watching any videos by the Duran, Alex Christoforou, or myself, Alexander Mercouris, that if you go to the top of the video, you will see a red maroon button there. If you press that red maroon button, it will take you directly to our locals homepage, where you can join our thriving locals community, participate if you just choose to become an active member in my locals live streams, which take place exclusively on locals every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time. And you can also publish your own exclusive content and publish comments on threads of various articles and other publications which you will find on our locals homepage. Well, today again we find ourselves pushed back to discussing the global crisis, though today I'm going to make it again, the emphasis will be on events in the actual fighting in Ukraine. There's been an awful lot going on elsewhere in the world, but as I've discussed in previous programs, one of the fascinating things about this particular crisis is that even crises that are taking place in various other parts of the world are starting to rearrange themselves in their particulars around the central crisis, which is the one in Ukraine. And I think it's becoming increasingly clear that this crisis isn't really about Ukraine at all. Well, in a sense that it's not specifically about the country or its people. Rather, Ukraine has, through its incredible bad luck, become the battlefield, the first battlefield in the great clash that is now taking place between the two big global power blocs, the collective West, led by the United States, and the new bloc that's formed over the last few years, consisting of China and Russia. Now, I think before I discuss those details a little bit further, I think the best thing to do, as is traditional, is to discuss first the situation on the ground. Now, after hours after I made my previous video, the Russian Ministry of Defense confirmed that the Moskva, the cruiser which acted as the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, had sunk whilst being towed back to Sevastopol after what the Russians said was an internal fire which had set some ammunition alight and which had created hull damage, which led to the ship sinking whilst it was being towed. Well, that's the official Russian line. In the West, we're getting a completely different story. There, the story is that the Moskva was struck by two Ukrainian Neptune missiles. These are missiles which are evolutions of the Soviet-era X-35 anti-ship missile, which is itself somewhat similar to the US Harpoon missile, and that it was these two missiles that caused the ships to experience its internal explosion and to suffer the damage which eventually caused it to sink. And by the way, there are, well, not perhaps exactly contradictory, but divergent accounts of the number of human casualties. The Russians haven't released any casualties, but they say that the crew was evacuated from the warship, giving the impression that most of the people on the warship were rescued. In fact, the way in which the Russian reports read, you'd get the impression that nearly everybody was saved. Whereas the Ukrainians are claiming that the captain of the ship and lots of other people, some say hundreds of people on the ship, died in the strike. Well, it's very difficult. It's impossible for me to tell the truth, to tell what the truth is. When I made my report yesterday, when I made my video yesterday, it was striking that the Pentagon was refusing to give an account one way or the other. It wasn't endorsing either the Ukrainian account or the Russian account. It was saying that he didn't know. And in fact, Pentagon spokesmen were quoted as saying that at the moment they were observing what had happened to the ship closely, that it seemed to be steaming back to Sevastopol on its own power, which seemed to rather support the Russian theory, but that they weren't able to give any explanation of why the ship had been struck or why the damage has been done to the ship. Well, hours passed, the Western media increasingly ran with the Ukrainian account. Parts of the Russian media did as well, by the way. These are those parts of the Russian media which tend to be critical of President Putin, more, by the way, from a communist stroke nationalist perspective than a liberal one. They claim that the fact that the Moskva had been hit in this way was symptomatic of the softness and corruption and weakness of the Russian military, and they blamed Putin for this, and they've been lobbying relentlessly, they've been calling relentlessly for Putin and the Russian government and the Russian military to take a much harder line, as they say, in the war in Ukraine, and basically to bring Russia onto a total war footing. So there's been that kind of commentary in Russia as well. Interestingly enough, though, and rather paradoxically, these commenters in Russian media who've been talking in this way have been accepting what is the Ukrainian account of the story in preference to that of their own defense ministry. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, 24 or so hours later, we started to see reports in the media, in the Western media, that the Pentagon is now saying, or appears to be now saying, that it was two Ukrainian missiles that caused the damage. Now, I say appeared to be saying, because firstly, this has taken, as I said, roughly a day for the Pentagon to come along and say this. And in fact, the Pentagon is not saying it publicly. It's not saying it on the record. Apparently, this has been something that's been said by two anonymous officials, our old friends, the anonymous officials that we always see in the United States. And they're saying not that they know for a fact that it was two Ukrainian missiles that struck the Moskva, but that they believe that it was, which seems to me to be rather less than complete knowledge. Well, I say that I'm basing that on reports in the British media, all of which, or at least those that I've seen from the reliable, or what I would consider the reasonably reliable publications, like the Financial Times, for example, all use that word believe. Now, let me say straight away that this may be true. I mean, I am not any kind of military person. I'm not prepared to say one way or another what caused this strike, or the ship to be damaged in this way. But what I will say is this. I am fairly sure that regardless of what did happen, the Pentagon will have come under a great deal of pressure to confirm the Ukrainian story. After all, the media is running with it. Some Western governments are running with it. The Ukrainian government itself is running with it. And the Ukrainians have even apparently published a postage stamp claiming that they sank the Moskva. So it would have been, I think, embarrassing for the Pentagon to hold out. And I'm sure that behind the scenes, anyway, there's been intense lobbying on the Pentagon to come out and say what it thinks was the cause of this loss of Moskva. Now, that makes it rather interesting that the Pentagon has sort of backed the Ukrainian story in this rather strange way, doing it in off-the-record comments by anonymous officials who say that they believe that it was two Neptune missiles launched by Ukraine that carried out this damage to this warship. Now, I want to say again, I'm not rushing to any judgments here. I simply don't know. One thing I will say, and which is indisputable, is that for the Russians, this is a debacle and a humiliation. Moskva was an old ship, 40 years old, not apparently in particularly good condition, but it was the fleet flagship. It is a large ship. It did have a crew of 500 people. It was participating in the mission, and it has now been lost. However you explain it, whatever the cause, the fact that the ship was lost is a major blow to the Russian Navy, to its prestige, and it's been treated like that within Russia itself. I would add that it does somewhat puzzle me that a ship of this size but age was pressed into the battle in such a way and was operating within apparently only 18 kilometers of the Ukrainian coast. And I wonder what he was doing and why more modern ships, of which, by the way, contrary to some claims, the Black Sea Fleet is not short of, couldn't have been taking its place. There's been some suggestions that what Moskva was doing was using its very powerful search radar, which is perhaps the most was the most useful part of the warship, that it was using this very powerful search radar to keep track of what was going on along the Ukrainian and also Romanian coast, Romania being, of course, a NATO ally and not that distant from Odessa itself. So maybe that is what it was doing. It still seems to me a strange thing to do, to use such a large and powerful ship, as also such a vulnerable ship, for such a purpose. I'm sure that the Russians have other means of keeping track of what's going on the coast of Romania and on the Ukrainian coast, and no doubt there was reasons and explanations, but no doubt also there will be a lot of hard questions about this in Russia itself, and perhaps one day we might find out what the truth is. Anyway, a humiliation for the Russians, a debacle for them. If the Ukrainians did manage to sink the ship, well, that would be a major win for them. And even if they didn't, it seems to me that this thing has played entirely to their advantage. As to why the Pentagon is proving so uneasy about coming down on either side in this story, at least up to now, well, I'm not going to speculate. It probably is the case that they generally don't know, and perhaps, for all I know, they have doubts about some aspects of the Ukrainian story. By the way, one explanation I have heard about US reticence, or the Pentagon's reticence, I largely discount. It's been suggested by some people, especially in Russia, that the United States played an active role in helping Ukraine to destroy this warship. And it's been pointed out that there was a US Global Hawk drone flying over this area of the Black Sea at the time. I personally don't accept this at all. It seems to me that even if the United States was involved, and I've seen no evidence of that, the US would simply say that it was the Ukrainians who did this all by themselves and would categorically deny that it played any role in this attack. And frankly, if it did that, I can't see who would challenge them, who would challenge the Pentagon if it were to say that in the West. So I don't really see what the US gains, or how the US would more effectively conceal its role than simply by denying that it played any role in what would otherwise have been a successful Ukrainian operation, which I would have expected the US and the Pentagon to want to promote. Anyway, that is all I'm going to say about Moskva. It's a sad loss of a apparently rather impressive looking warship. She was very old. She was 40 years old. Most of her weapon systems were outdated. Apparently, she had been intended to be scrapped around the late 1990s, but it was the mayor of Moscow at that time, the exceptionally corrupt Yuri Lushkov, who decided, basically as a publicity stunt, to fund her retention in service. That was why her name, by the way, was changed from her original name, which was Slava, which means glory, to Moskva. And that kept her in service, arguably long past her proper retirement date, and that the Russian Navy was perhaps skeptical of doing so and did not prioritize her, is shown by the fact that she did not receive any modernization as some of her sister ships have done. Anyway, that's all, as I said, I'm going to say about Slava or Moskva and about this story. A defeat, a humiliation for the Russians, irrespective of how she came to be lost. But we can perhaps over-concentrate on Moskva rather than on the actual progress of the military operation itself. And of course, the big events have been happening in Mariupol, where it's now the case that the last holdout of Ukrainian resistance, you might not quite get that impression from reading some of the Western media. The last holdout is now the Azovstal steelworks. There are apparently still some Ukrainian troops scattered in various parts of the city, generally fairly close to the steelworks. Apparently one group, about 200, tried to break out and reach the steelworks to the comparative safety of the steelworks, to consolidate with whatever Ukrainian troops are still left there. But the Russians claim that this group was identified and tracked down, and the Russians speak about it as if it had been completely destroyed. They also, by the way, continue to claim that more and more Ukrainian troops in Mariupol, except those in the Azovstal steelworks itself, are now giving up and surrendering. Over the course of the last few hours, there was a notable escalation in the actual fighting in Mariupol, or at least a very unprecedented in terms of this war event happened, which is that at least two Tupolev, heavy Tupolev 22 M3 bombers dropped bombs directly on the Azovstal steelworks. Now, I read in parts of the Western media that this is somehow a response to the loss of Moskva. I have to say, I think that is certainly wrong. I am sure that the purpose of these bombers, who were apparently dropping these bombs on the Azovstal steelworks from fairly high altitudes, was that they were dropping heavy concrete busting bombs on the Azovstal steelworks, presumably to damage or destroy some of these tunnels and bunkers underneath these steelworks that we've been hearing so much about. Now, the Russians do have concrete busting, bunker busting bombs, as of course the Americans do. These tend to be very large bombs, or so I understand. They're made in a special way with a special steel casing. They usually have a jet engine to propel them to very high speeds as they hit their target, and in order to provide them with even greater velocity and kinetic energy, they tend to be dropped from aircraft flying at relatively high altitudes. So given that these are big bombs, and given that they have to be launched or dropped from very high altitudes, I think that explains why these big Tupolev bombers were used for this raid. And I've been doing some research on the internet, easy for anybody to do. I find that the Russians have or advertise one particular bunker busting or concrete busting bomb, the BTAB 500, which has a 500 kilogram warhead, but I'm sure that they also have much bigger ones. And according to what I read in open sources, the Tupolev bombers can carry payloads of up to 24,000 kilograms. In other words, up to 24 tons on a mission. Though they don't usually carry anything like that much, but certainly they could carry these BTAB 500 bombs, and probably the Russians have bigger ones too. So I presume that this is what that was all about. This is the intention, was to use these heavy bunker busting bombs launched or dropped from these high flying heavy bombers with a view to demolishing these bunkers and tunnels where these Ukrainian troops are supposed to be hiding. And by the way, Denis Bushilin, who is the Prime Minister of the breakaway Donetsk People's Republic, which the Russians have recognized as an independent state, he says that he doesn't expect the Ukrainian forces in the Azovstal steelworks to surrender. These are dedicated, committed troops belonging presumably mainly to the Azov battalion, and who are not prepared, who are prepared to fight to the last. And so he says, Bushilin says, that these troops will be completely destroyed. How long this operation is going to take, how long it's going to take to completely destroy these Ukrainian forces in the steelworks, I have absolutely no idea. I would point out that battles in urban areas can take a very long time. If one is looking at recent battles in the Middle East, the siege and eventual capture of Raqqa, the capital of the Islamic State in northern Syria, took approximately, it took place from June to October 2017. It was a prolonged siege, and I would add, again, judging from the details that I've seen, that Raqqa seems to be in a city roughly with the same sort of population as Mariupol, and the fighters, the Islamic State fighters who were there, numbered apparently around 5,000, and they were outnumbered by the Kurdish fighters who were besieging the city. The relative ratios seem to have been roughly the same as what we're seeing in Mariupol today, though I would say that the bombing, which was of Raqqa, was much heavier than anything we've seen in Mariupol up to now, and the shelling, and of course a lot of that was carried out by the US military, who were of course supporting the Kurds. Now, an even bigger siege that also was taking place at roughly the same time, or just before in fact, was the siege of Mosul, a city of about 3.5 million, which is about the size of Kiev. Again, suggestions are that there were about 10,000 Islamic State fighters in Mosul. The besieging Iraqi forces numbered in excess of 100,000, and that siege lasted around 9 months. So even though the fighters there were outnumbered 10-1, as I said, that siege took a very long time. Now, there's been some disagreement about the number of Ukrainian troops in Mariupol. Some put the number at 14,500 at the outset of the fighting back in February. That appears to come from Ukrainian sources. The Russians put the figures higher, they put them at 20,000. So it seems that the garrison in Mariupol may have been bigger than the Islamic State garrisons in Raqqa and Mosul, and perhaps the besieging forces had smaller ratios of superiority in terms of numbers, and there doesn't seem in truth to have been the same amount of shelling and bombing of Mariupol as we saw in Raqqa and in Mosul. But if that is correct, if there is any utility in these comparisons, and I'm not a military person, so perhaps I'm making comparisons which are faulty in some ways. But if there is any utility in these comparisons, then it seems to me that the siege of Mariupol has not so far lasted that long. But as I said, how long it will take to storm or capture or destroy the Ukrainian forces in the Azovstal steelworks, that I'm not, frankly, going to try and guess. I would finish my discussion of the events in Mariupol by once again saying that if it is the case that these Ukrainian troops in the Azovstal steelworks are committed to fighting to the death, then I think that is a tragedy. I think they should think of their families, their fathers and brothers and sisters, their children if they have any, their wives and girlfriends and their friends. And I think that given that the outcome of this is not in doubt, I think they should choose life over death, especially a death which, if it's coming in the form of entrapment or destruction in underground bunkers with these huge bombs falling on them, well, it looks utterly grisly and horrific to me. There is similar fighting going on in various other parts of Ukraine as well. And the Russians have been reporting advances in places like Popasnaya, which is a settlement that has been much contested recently, and Rubizhnoye, and also in the outskirts of Severodonetsk, the Severodonetsk-Lysych agglomeration now looks as if it's, to all intents and purposes, fully encircled, and apparently an oil refinery in Lysych has now also been destroyed by the Russians in a Russian missile strike. And there's also been talk of very heavy shelling and attacks on Ukrainian troops by the Russians in the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, with the Russians still pressing forward from ETHEREUM. There's some reports, which, by the way, are not corroborated by some of these map readings that one sees, but who knows how accurate those map readings are? Who knows how accurate these reports are? But there are reports that the Russians have reached a town called Liman, which would suggest that there's been quite a significant advance by the Russians in this area, and that earlier reports that at least Russian advance units are closing in on Slavyansk and Kramatorsk and have reached the country areas around those two towns, that there might be some truth to it. I can't corroborate these claims, and I'm not going to try to. There's also reports that the Ukrainians have been trying to send reinforcements to the area around Izium. They've made various attempts to launch counterattacks there. Again, if one believes the Russians, none of these counterattacks appear to have been successful, and the Russians are claiming that the Ukrainians are suffering massive casualties, and the Russian Defense Ministry even claimed that one particular Ukrainian unit had suffered up to 40% casualties. I can't confirm that figure. The Ukrainians dispute these completely. Zelensky has claimed that around 3,000 Ukrainian troops have been killed, and another Ukrainian official said that 700 have been taken prisoner, and that seems to be the totality of the losses that the Ukrainians are admitting to since the start of the war in February. I have to say that I don't believe these figures, especially the last one, the claim that only 700 prisoners are in Russian hands. Surely, if the photographic evidence is correct, far more prisoners have been taken in Mariupol than 700. The Russians claim that they've taken around 1,600 prisoners now in Mariupol alone. And the forces of the Donetsk People's Republic have been claiming that they've taken 3,000 that they're holding 3,000 Ukrainian prisoners in total. So I'm not going to give any credence to any one of these figures, except that the mass surrenders in Mariupol do seem to be real. But anyway, I'm not going to assume that these claims that Ukrainian units have lost up to 40% of their men are necessarily true. I would say that I continue to see pictures and videos, which I'm not providing a link to, which show enormous numbers of Ukrainian soldiers dead in various parts of the battle. And of course, there's even been a really profoundly upsetting one from Mariupol, which shows what appear to be body parts of Ukrainian soldiers in some sort of trash can or dustbin. I don't even want to go there and speculate on what that photograph actually means, but that's just one example of some deeply disturbing pictures I've seen. I'm certainly not providing links to anything like that. Well, alongside these actual battles in the ground war, the Russians have been steadily intensifying their missile strikes all over Ukraine, and they're now starting increasingly to attack factories and plants and industrial facilities around Kiev, which they have not been doing up to now over the course of this war. And it does seem altogether that the Russian air operation, as phase 2, the big offensive in Donbass, cranks into higher gear, that this air offensive is now intensifying. As I understand it, most of the air-to-ground attacks by Russian aircraft, including helicopters, taking place in the Donbass, with heavy attacks, heavy air attacks and shelling of Ukrainian army formations and supply lines to Donbass and elsewhere. But there are missile strikes taking place all over Ukraine, including, by the way, in western Ukraine, targeting, as far as I can see, all the usual things: industrial facilities, scientific places that the Russians claim are involved in providing support for the Ukrainian war effort, oil refineries. Apparently all 3 of Ukraine's major oil refineries have now been destroyed, airfields, ammunition dumps, that sort of thing. Meanwhile, as that continues, the Western powers, for their part, have been supplying more weapons to Ukraine, or at least they say they have. And this too, by the way, has become something of a cause célèbre in the Russian media. They're talking about this all the time. Again, some of these sort of more communist or hardline nationalist, anti-Putin type websites have been making big plays about these weapon systems. And of course, so has the Western media as well. I will say that up to now, it does seem to me that the reality of what these weapon systems amount to is not quite living up to some of the claims that one is seeing. I mean, there's talk about up to 300 T-72 tanks from Poland and the Czech Republic being sent to Ukraine. Well, the Russians claim that they've destroyed up to 2,200 Ukrainian tanks and armoured vehicles. Doesn't seem to me as if these replacement tanks are going to alter the equations very much. I would add that the Russians claim to have destroyed around 300 tanks and armoured vehicles, Ukrainian tanks and armoured vehicles, over the last 2 weeks. Of course, I can't verify those figures, but anyway, that does seem to be the case. There is a huge amount of play about the fact that the United States is providing 18 Howitzers. The Russians have said that the Western powers have already been providing Ukraine with artillery for some time. So again, I'm not quite sure why this makes such a huge difference. There's suggestions that Ukraine is now being provided with some laser-guided shells, But actually, in reality, Ukraine has already had those. So again, I'm not quite sure why this fundamentally changes the picture. And obviously, there's been many more supplies of Javelin missiles and Stinger anti-aircraft missiles and Starstrike systems from Britain, which, by the way, look rather bulky. And from what I'm told, there are not many of them in existence anyway, because they're rather expensive and they're apparently quite difficult to use, even though they are extremely effective when they are used. But anyway, it does seem to me that those weapon systems that are being deployed up to now have been more of the same. There have also been some rather muddled comments about this in parts of the Western media. I read in the Daily Telegraph an article which seemed to imply that the Mi-17 helicopters that the United States is supplying to Ukraine are American helicopters. Well, they're American helicopters in the sense that they belong to the United States, but of course they are actually Russian built. They are in fact helicopters which the United States bought from Russia at one time and which it had intended to supply to the Afghan army, the army in Afghanistan that collapsed back in August. So these do not seem to me to be the most advanced weapon systems that the United States certainly has. Perhaps one day they will provide something more. But anyway, and as has been pointed out by any number of military people, for the United States or Germany or France or any of these other countries to provide really advanced Western weapons to Ukraine, and for the Ukrainians to learn how to operate these weapon systems, would take many months. And by then, one would assume that the battle in Donbass will be over. Besides which, I suspect that the Russians anyway could probably counter some of these systems as well. I would say that two of them, one of the more exotic systems that we've been hearing a lot about, the Switchblade American kamikaze drones. These are essentially anti-tank drones, that small anti-tank drones that fly at altitudes, loiter, and then wait to see a target, and then are sent to attack the target from above. That these have now been used by Ukraine against Russian tank formations, but the Russians claim that they have not been used to any very great effect. By the way, the Russians have similar drones to Switchblade, and they've also been used in some of the fighting. Some of them were used in some of the fighting around Kiev a few weeks ago, for example. And I don't get the impression that they were particularly effective either. So it may be that these are complicated weapons to use, or it may be that there's mechanisms to defend against them, or maybe they've not really been, the people who are using them haven't really worked out how to use them properly. But anyway, for what it's worth, they've been used for the first time with limited effect. We'll see whether that changes. But that seems to me to be overall the situation on the ground. In Mariupol, we are probably, as I said, now literally at the very last scene of the very last act. Azovstal, heavily bombed. There's no civilians apparently in Azovstal, or at least no residential areas in the factory itself. So the Russians can drop these heavy bunker-busting bombs on it, and it's the only place, the only holdout left in Mariupol for these Ukrainian troops. Elsewhere, heavy fighting in the Donbass as the Russians now shell and bomb Ukrainian forces in prior to making incremental advances on them as they tighten the cauldron, as it's called, that they have established around these forces. So that seems to me the major ground fighting, and across Ukraine, long-range strikes by Russian troops, by Russian missile troops, and of course arms supplies from the West, which have been attracting a huge amount of publicity, which so far don't seem to be, to me, to be enough to change the outcome of the battle. I'm going to make one last observation about these Western supplies, which is that there's a lot of speculation about what they're for. Some of these systems will no doubt be sent to the front lines, but my own sense is that with Ukraine having lost most of its armoured fleet and many of its most advanced weapon systems, I suspect that the intention is less to try to rescue the forces in Donbass and more to try to reconstitute some sort of Ukrainian army, provide it with fresh armour and artillery and infantry fighting vehicles and all the rest in central and western Ukraine in case of a further Russian offensive westward after the Ukrainian forces in Donbass have been destroyed. That seems to me to make more sense. But again, I don't pretend to be a military person. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Free to hear from what other people have to say, and we shall wait and see. In the meantime, there has been a diplomatic exchange between the Russians and the Americans. The Russians have supposedly sent a démarche, as it's called, a strong letter of protest to the State Department saying that Western arms supplies to Ukraine are extremely dangerous and could result in dangerous consequences. And that's provoked a response from the United States saying that they will continue to send these arms to Ukraine. They're not paying any attention to what the Russians are saying. And we know about this because the Washington Post has written a piece about this. And we've also had these comments from the US State Department. Now, that could be a sign of Russian nervousness or anger about these arms supplies from the West, though to be straightforward about this, the Russians have actually complained publicly for quite a long time about these arms supplies. They're saying that these arms supplies are reckless, they will have these unpredictable consequences, and that the West is simply prolonging the war by persisting with these arms supplies and giving the Ukrainians false hope, which keeps the Ukrainians fighting. So that's one. So, it would not be a fundamental shift from the Russian line. But I wonder whether also the Russians aren't perhaps quietly also warning the Americans that all these people who are coming to Ukraine from all over the world to fight there, and some of these people in Ukraine itself, some of these far-right fighters in Ukraine, are people who can't be trusted with weapons, and that it could result in all sorts of problems for everybody eventually when the fighting eventually ends. Who knows? In which case, I would say, if it is that kind of exchange, and I suspect exchanges like this between the Russians and the Americans take place often, it could simply be that whoever decided to publish details of this letter in the Washington Post was doing it as a way of showing US resolve rather more than because the Russians were saying, in fact, anything new. The Russians, by the way, have barely commented on this story. Anyway, that's where we are with the war on in Ukraine. One further point I have to make. It seems that negotiations have now essentially collapsed. The Ukrainians in Istanbul did make some very substantive concessions. Certain Western governments, those of the United States and Britain, were very unhappy with the concessions that Ukraine was making, and they persuaded the Ukrainians to cancel those concessions. The United States, or at least the State Department, is talking about a war going on in Ukraine until the end of 2022, or perhaps even beyond that. So it's clear to me that the Americans and the British, but certainly especially the Americans, are looking for a prolonged war. They presumably believe that this will ultimately weaken Russia. I'm far from convinced that this is true. I think a much more likely outcome of such a war is not stalemate, if that is what the US expects. It is the eventual complete destruction of Ukraine. I mean, if at the end of this particular battle in Donbass, the Ukrainians continue resisting and continue refuse to negotiate, then it seems to me that the chances are that the Russians will indeed start to press west. And of course, if they do press west, and if the fighting continues in this level of intensity, then the real risk is that steadily, eventually, all of Ukraine will be occupied. Ukraine will continue to cobble together forces to fight the Russians. The West will send more arms supplies. Eventually, those forces will be broken and dispersed. That will then mean that the Russians move even a little bit further west. So ultimately, it seems to me that this, will undoubtedly hurt Russia in the sense that Russians will be killed. And obviously, Russia will lose military equipment, just as they've lost the Moskva. But ultimately, the danger is that Ukraine itself could be completely destroyed, in which case, I'm not sure how that weakens Russia geopolitically. I would have thought, on the contrary, the country which would be more plausibly geopolitically weakened would be the United States. I say that because I very much consider this attempt to bring in Sweden and Finland into NATO. It looks to me very much like, to be straightforward about it, an attempted consolation prize following the loss of Ukraine, and that doesn't look to me like any kind of meaningful substitute. So that's the first thing to say. The second is, of course, this huge commitment the United States is making to Ukraine is now, to a great extent, investing American prestige in Ukraine, and, by the way, British prestige also. If there is an ultimate Ukrainian defeat, that will be damaging for the US. But also, in the meantime, it seems that this massive flood of Javelin missiles and Stinger missiles and other such missiles to Ukraine is now critically depleting US stocks, to the point where, according to some parts of the US media, they might even be difficult for the United States itself to replace. So again, this doesn't seem to me to be a particularly wise strategy from a military and geopolitical point of view. But beyond that, prolonging the war in that kind of way is also going to prolong the economic war of attrition. Now, I suspect that there are still people in Washington who believe that the United States will ultimately prevail against Russia in this war. Maybe they're right, but what if they're wrong? At the moment, we know that the United States expected back in February that the seizure of the assets of the Russian central bank and the sanctions imposed upon it and the de-swifting of Russian banks, that would cause a collapse of the Russian financial system and a further collapse of the Russian economy, and that it would lead to a crisis within Russia and a potential overthrow of President Putin and of his government. Well, that was clearly wrong. That didn't happen. Maybe an economic war of attrition against Russia isn't going to go as well as some people in Washington still think. Maybe the Russians, who are busy reorganizing their economy, are right to think that they can prevail in such an economic war. After all, they have resources, they're not short of food, they're not short of energy, and they do have future customers or even current customers for some of their raw materials exports, like China, India, which is looking apparently now to buy Russian coal and which already buys Russian oil, and who knows whom else. So maybe this is a miscalculation. Well, I say that because if it is a miscalculation and the prolongation of the war and the prolongation of the economic war only results in much higher inflation in the West, then increasingly there's going to be political consequences for Western politicians. President Biden's ratings are continuing to fall. They're now in their 30s by most surveys that I've seen. 2/3 of people in Britain apparently want Prime Minister Johnson to resign if he's fined again over the Partygate affair, the Partygate scandal, where he held parties, or rather his officials held parties with his participation in the garden of number 10 Downing Street during the toughest period of the pandemic. Maybe, but I can't help but think that these demands for Prime Minister Johnson's resignation from the British public to some extent reflect the sharp deterioration that many British people are feeling in their living standards, which is, to be straightforward about it, directly connected to this economic war. And of course that's Britain and the United States. I suspect it's going to play out in the same way across many other countries in North America and in Europe eventually as well. And of course, as has been pointed out by many people, including myself, the effect of this economic war on the global south will be catastrophic, potentially catastrophic, with many people being pushed to the margins there as food prices explode. If that results in further political instability across the global south, that could affect supply chains further. That could also translate into even higher inflation and a deepening inflation crisis across the entire world. I would have thought that all the conditions really point more to the need for a compromise than for a prolonged war. There is something dangerously obsessive about this refusal to negotiate in earnest, this unwillingness to sit down and find a compromise, something that extends all the way back to 2014, to the sabotage of the Minsk agreement, to the refusal to discuss NATO's open door, despite the fact that it was always said that, Ukraine wouldn't join NATO anytime soon, and the West wasn't prepared to fight to defend it. This insistence that Ukraine refused to compromise on anything substantive. This, it seems to me, is bad for Ukraine. No doubt it's bad for Russia, but it's also very bad for the West, and it's disastrous for the world as well. Obsession is a very dangerous thing. It can lead people into all kinds of bad outcomes, and it has no place in global politics, in statesmanship. I think that, as I said, the outlines for an agreement are there. A step was made in that direction during the talks in Istanbul. The wise thing to do for Western leaders is to put their fixations about Mr. Putin and Russia to one side and support countries like Turkey and Belarus and India and to some extent China, and urge the Ukrainians to make that compromise, which admittedly will result in the loss of Crimea and Donbass forever, but perhaps will bring peace to this tormented land and will bring peace also to the world. Well, that's my view. It's my long-standing view. This has been a long video on a Saturday. I will leave it there. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon. Future programs on this channel. I would also remind you again that you can find us on various other platforms. I mentioned Rumble and Locals. And of course, you can see also our other channels there, the Duran and Alex Christophorou's channel. And of course, if you want to support us, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and also by going to our shop, buying the great things that you will find there, our shirts, like this amazing shirt I'm wearing now, our bomber jackets, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, our mugs, our hats, all of these great things. And of course, you can also support us by pressing the like button to this video and by checking your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. Have a good day, and more from me soon.